Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our fourth session in the series, Why Marx? Tonight we're looking at capital. Not quite as easygoing as Communist Manifesto, which we dealt with yesterday. It's a bit tough going, no doubt about it, in the original German as well as the English translation. I've tried both. Most people give up at around chapter 3, and I'm no exception, I have to admit. David Harvey provides very good service on his YouTube channel. He's talking through capital, but he's not a Marxist, which you keep in mind, and on occasion draws conclusions that are not necessarily those of Marxists, but we would recommend comrades watch it. Capital is quite unlike many other works of Marx, and definitely unlike the Communist Manifesto. It's not a guide to action for communists. It doesn't tell us how to get rid of capitalism. It simply explains it. In fact, it is so thorough and so convincing that even bourgeois economists still often refer to it, not that they necessarily have read or understood it properly. But we want to look tonight at how capital came about, the main lessons of the books, and if they are indeed still relevant today. In one session, we can only provide a teaser, and forgive us for not going into details on this or that law that you might have wanted to discuss. But we will be revisiting capital, as many other issues, in more details in the second part of this series after the initial 8 sessions. So we'll be coming back to it. So we're going to start with Ian Spencer, who will briefly explain the background to Marx's seminal work. Hi, comrade.
Good evening, comrades. As you see, volume 1 of Marx's Capital is subtitled A Critique of Political Economy. So what's political economy? Political economy is to economics what jurisprudence is to law. That is, it's the philosophy of economics. While economics asks things like what determines the price of a cup of tea, political economy asks the fundamental questions like, what do we mean when we say that something has value? What determines that value? What sectors of the economy are productive in the sense of offering a surplus or profits? Different schools of thought approach the latter question in different ways. For example, the mercantilists, such as Jean-Baptiste Colbert, writing in the 17th century, emphasise mercantile profit from export as the productive sector of the economy. By contrast, the physiocrats, such as Francois Quesnay, writing in the 18th century, stress the importance of agricultural production as the source of national wealth. Crucially, though, for Marx, the real target of his critique was the classical political economists, in particular Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Adam Smith, who's snappily titled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. David Ricardo, the Member of Parliament for the Rotten Borough of Portarlington in Ireland, published his most famous work, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, in 1817. The crucial question at the heart of Smith and Ricardo's political economy was the origin of value. Early in Smith's book, he poses the famous water and diamonds paradox. Why is it that water, without which nothing can live, be worth scarce anything in financial terms? By contrast, diamonds, which have few practical uses, are worth a great deal. Smith's reply is the amount of labour it takes to win them from nature. Water is abundant, while diamonds take a huge amount of labour to secure and craft. Smith follows this up with the assertion that if it takes twice as long to catch a beaver as a deer, then 2 deer will naturally exchange for 1 beaver. Smith is arguing that it is labour embodied in a commodity which determines its value. That is, both Smith and Ricardo understood the exploitation of workers as the origin of value, but this poses a problem for the classical political economists. If it's central to capitalism that things exchange at or near their value, and there has to be an exchange of equivalence as part of any legal contract, where do profits come from? It's Marx that exposes this contradiction at the heart of classical political economy. In the end, Smith ends up with a sort of markup theory of profits, where the surplus is merely added to the total cost of production. All classical political economists, as well as Marx, tried to argue that profits were not merely the product of cheating. Moreover, the social stock of wealth can't be increased by simply buying cheap and selling dear. Something to remember the next time someone is boring you with how much their house has increased in value. An individual capitalist might be able to make a profit that way, such as we buy any car. But for one party to win, someone else must lose, and the social stock of wealth is unchanged. Here the target for Marx's critique was anarchists such as Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whose assertion that property is theft was conclusively refuted by Marx. Marx regarded Proudhon as a poor political economist and an even poorer understanding of the philosophy of Hegel, which suffused Marx's work. Marx's book, The Poverty of Philosophy, was a scathing critique of Proudhon's philosophy of poverty. So Marx solves the riddle by arguing that in order to produce a surplus without cheating, there must be one commodity which can yield more value than it costs to produce it: labour power, or the capacity to work. Marx's journey to completing volume 1 of Capital was a long one. In fact, it began with Friedrich Engels, who first met Marx in 1842. Engels was the first of the two friends to write a contribution to the critique of political economy in 1843, which was published in the German-French yearbook, of which Marx was editor. Later, when Marx and Engels met in Paris in 1844, he began the work that culminated in Capital. Marx wrote the economic and philosophic manuscripts, otherwise known as the Paris manuscripts, in 1844, which were never intended for publication, but like much of his writing was written for self-clarification or as a rough draft. Later, in 1859, Marx published a contribution to the critique of political economy. In this work and in the preparatory materials written in 1857-8, subsequently published as the Grundrisse, he asserts that the worker sells his or her labour. By the publication of Capital in 1867, this had clarified to the worker sells his or her labour power, that is, the capacity to labour. And with this distinction, he solved one of the contradictions of classical political economy. The capitalist buys labour power, the capacity to labour, in the way that you or I might buy a car, a commodity which, when consumed, yields transport. One doesn't buy transport, but potential transport in the shape of a car. Similarly, the capitalist buys labour power, a commodity which, when consumed, yields labour. The difference between labour power and all other commodities is it yields more value than it costs to produce it. So let's imagine that a capitalist pays £100 for a worker's labour power for a working day of 8 hours. However, the worker has produced enough commodities, let's say shoes, in 4 hours to be equal to £100. However, the contract between the capitalist and the worker is for an 8-hour day, and the worker goes on to produce another £100 worth of shoes for the second half of the day. No one is being cheated here. The worker's labour power has been bought for what it costs to produce it in terms of the value of the food, accommodation, and other things that the worker needs to live. The fact that the worker goes on to produce commodities worth more than his or her wage is the basis of surplus value and ultimately profit. This is also the basis on which the exploitation of labour is made opaque and mysterious. On the one hand, the capitalist and the worker freely enter into an employment contract. Therefore, slogans like a fair day's pay for a fair day's work are simply nonsense. All capitalists can claim to pay a fair day's pay. That's not the point. The extraction of a surplus from the proletariat appears to be based upon a freely entered into contract. You're not a slave or a serf. Under capitalism, all workers are free in law. In fact, they're so free, they're free to starve. Whilst the worker can formally work for whoever they want, they have no choice but to sell their one marketable commodity, themselves. The proletarian sells a commodity which cannot be separated from his or her physical person. You might have nothing else under capitalism, but you do have the right to work. What you don't have is the right to a job or to have your needs met. The nature of capitalism is that poverty is a necessary condition for the existence of wealth. Without the overwhelming majority of the population having only themselves to sell, the capitalist cannot make a surplus. So when unions haggle over the price of labour power, there is an acceptance of the exploitation of labour and the alienation of it. The aim of communism is the abolition of commodity production, including the commodity of labour power. On that basis, the communist society aims for the free creative labour of all. As is well known, only volume 1 of Capital was written for publication. The subsequent publication of Marx's preparatory materials, the Grundrisse, showed to anyone who thinks that dialectical philosophy derived from Hegel is a kind of add-on or incidental, is just wrong. In a famous letter written to Friedrich Engels, Marx talked about how important it was to reread Hegel's logic in writing Capital. And it suffuses the work of both Marx and Engels. The original plan for Capital was to be in 6 volumes. This was laid out in Marx's preparatory writings in 1857. As we see here, volume 1 was to cover the production process, the circulation of capital, profit and interest. It was also to have volumes on landed property, wage labour, the state and the world market. By 1865 to 6, a form closer to the current work has taken the shape of 3 volumes. Volume 1 is concerned with the production process of capital, Volume 2 on the circulation of capital, and Volume 3, the process of capitalist production as a whole. At Marx's death in 1883, Engels was shocked to discover that Volumes 2 and 3 of Capital only existed in note form, and Engels spent much of his remaining years preparing these notes for publication, despite Marx's notoriously difficult handwriting. Engels himself had played an important role in the development of Capital. The two discussed every aspect of the work as it developed, and of course were supplemented by Engels' own researches, as well as his experience in the work in his work in the family firm of Ehrman and Engels in Salford. This led to the publication of The Condition of the Working Class in England. In addition, Engels supported Marx financially, both directly and indirectly, by writing articles and crediting them to Marx. Engels then was Marx's literary executor and died of laryngeal cancer shortly after the publication of Volume 3 of Capital in 1984. With the publication of Volume 1, Capital has given us the most important insight into how the capitalist system works and exploits labour.
Ian, I think you've put something over your microphone. It sounds a bit like we're in a swimming pool. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. So what we're left with then is a method of understanding not only a science of society, but also of its transformation. Much of what passes for socialism today, such as the politics of Jeremy Corbyn, is based on the writings not of Marx, but of John Maynard Keynes, an economist wholly committed to the continuance of capitalism and the exploitation and alienation of human labour. Many of the preparatory materials for Capital were not published until long after the death of Marx and Engels. The Grundrisse was not available in German until 1939 to 41, and not in English until the publication of a Pelican paperback in 1973. Theories of Surplus Value, sometimes called the 4th volume of Capital, was published in an edited and partial form between 1905 and 10 by Karl Kautsky, and is regarded as more a reflection of the interpretation of Marx, of Kautsky's interpretation of Marx, than an accurate understanding of Marx's critique of the political economists. A full definitive German edition was not published in Mega until between 1977 and 1979. It became available in English in volumes 30 to 34 of the collected works between 1988 and 1994. A fuller discussion of the making of Marx's Capital was published by Roman Rozdolsky in 2 volumes in 1977. Bourgeois economics is the loyal servant of the ruling class. Its fundamental precepts are intended to obscure the exploitation of human labour as the origin of value and therefore profit. In Capital, Marx and Engels have left us with the most invaluable legacy for understanding not only the past, but also the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. Now over to John Holliday, and I'm going to share the screen for him. There you go.
Hello. Thanks for that, Ian, and the background to the making of Marx's Capital, because I think it is always important to bear in mind that you call them the previous works, but of course a lot of them are written before Capital. I think you referred to the theories of surplus value as volume 4 of Capital, but I think it was published before. It was written in the note form. I think something like 1863 or something. So it is very complicated, and that strikes me when you're reading all of Marx. Really, that there's so much of it's in note form, translated at different times and different periods, and it's that's confusing. And even the 3 volumes of Capital that we've got are published or written at different times, and very often in note form. For instance, Volume 2, large parts of it are written after Volume 3, so it's very difficult to get a sequence of events, but I think it's important to bear that in mind. And what it does point out to me is that Capital is an unfinished work. It's largely, lots of Marx's writings are in note form, which you sort about him clarifying his ideas and developing his ideas in debates with other people. So I think, and throughout reading Capital Volume 1 or Capital Volume 3, he's going backwards and forwards between the volumes and to previous works that you've mentioned. Anyway, just on the topic, I've got this the short straw of talking about capital, I think, as a whole, as a volume, which is a very difficult subject. And I hope people will accept that I'm not going to be able to cover even Capital Volume 1 as a whole, let alone the 3 volumes. I hope people will also accept that this is just my point of view or my interpretation, because I think it is important when reading Capital. It's open to so much interpretation that it's very difficult for one person to come out with the definitive guide, apart from probably from Marx himself, and I doubt if even he could do it at times. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. If people are thinking of reading Capital, then I think the best way to do it is with other people, either in a group or with some form of commentary like Harvey presents. So it's discussed, so you can get a different point of view and different interpretations, because the texts are so complex that without that it's difficult to understand. First of all, just on that first slide, what I'm trying to talk about there is what Ian has mentioned about that critique of political economy that Marx starts out with. I think with all of the discussion of Marx, the first thing that people say to you when you talk about Marx is, well, he was an economic, people who are opposed generally anyway, will say he's an economic determinist. Everything is economics, there's no, it's not the way society really is. It's all about a basic, underlying feature that determines everything else. But if you then turn on the news, all you hear is interest rates going up, inflation, stock markets crashing, prices, wages, everything, currency rates. Just been listening to it now. They're talking about the Centrica profits. So, the reflection of society is generally that economic determinism. Everything in the bourgeois press or most things on the news, etc., reflect that economic determinism. It's constantly about the economic life of society. Far from being an economic determinist, in my view, Marx is a critic of economic determinism. He's trying to show that there are underlying features that get beneath that and explain that in a different way to reveal human beings' creativity, how things change, how things have been different in the past and can be different in the future. So I'll start with that. You talked about the critique of political economy, and I think it is all about it. It's a critique of the bourgeois categories, the things that determine our lives: capital, land, rent, interest, money, wages, a critique of those factors of production, labor, etc., that are meant to explain, but also determine the way in which we view society. They determine our lives. People will say, constantly talking about money all the time. It's the factor, a category that dominates our lives, and yet few people understand what it is, and yet it determines much of what we have to do. But it's a factor of production. I think what Marx is trying to do is go beneath these categories of production, beneath the market forces, the appearances that we're all faced with on a daily basis, to what lies beneath. And that's what, in my opinion, is the important feature of Marx's work in Capital and his other works on political economy. He's concerned not so much with the surface appearances, the market relations, but with what goes on underneath, the production process. So when Marx talks about, it always strikes me, well, it struck me very recently, talking about capitalism, he doesn't talk about capitalism because people misunderstand capitalism. They see it as a market-based society, buying and selling, buying cheap to sell dear, entrepreneurs coming up with ideas of what to produce and how to take advantage of the market system. Marx talks about the capitalist mode of production. He talks about the capitalist as a personification of capital. What I think he is trying to do is get beneath those surface appearances, the market appearances, to the productive features of society. And in doing that, he's trying to reveal the exploitative nature of capitalist society, which the bourgeois economists, the classical political economists, don't take account of. theirs is an idealist interpretation, doesn't reveal how capital will work and how it doesn't fulfill people's potential, and is unable to deal with crisis and those features of the capitalist economy. So in order to do that, Marx is trying to develop what he calls a science, a critical science, a critique of bourgeois categories. So he tries to go beneath the appearances of society, the market forces, to the essence, to the underlying features of that society. Now, he will take, and he does in Capital, if I can just quote from that in the first volume of Society, focusing on a particular form of mode of production, a particular mode of production. So he says, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of the commodity. So he's abstracted from the whole mode of production to a particular feature of it, the commodity. Now, why does he do that? I mean, he could have started with money, he could have started with any of those abstractions from the whole feature, the social relations of production. In my opinion, he focuses on that commodity because it is the item that we're all familiar of. Everybody is involved in buying and selling in order to live. So he's examining that particular feature of society, capitalist society, in order to reveal things about capitalist society as a whole. Now, I've got two quotes on there about the commodity because he's careful to go into that, but the two, he distinguishes in discussing the commodity in the early chapters of Capital, which are the most difficult ones, but the most interesting ones, in my opinion, and lay the basis for further analysis. He distinguishes between use value and exchange value. So first of all, the commodity has to be something that is useful to people. It has to fulfill a human need, to be related to some sort of need. It's something that's produced for other people. So it's a social form. A commodity is not something that you produce for yourself. You can grow vegetables in the garden. They don't take a commodity form. In the commodity form of use value, they're produced for sale, but they have to be something that people want. Now, he doesn't say that has to be necessarily a material good. So he says the nature of such wants, whether, for instance, they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. So he will talk about commodities not only being something that you can use, a toy, a computer, etc. It can be a book, it can be teaching, it can be anything that can be sold and supply a human need. Now, when you look at that, what he's interested in that particular, it's not true that he just dismisses use value, although production for use is prevalent in all forms of society. What he's interested in is predominantly that quote beneath, the value form, the exchange value. Why do things exchange, and what determines their exchange rates? Why does one thing find its expression in another form and enable it to be traded? I think that I've highlighted there that not an atom of matter enters into its composition, because people continually said, and they're right, that Marx is a materialist, but his materialism is quite different than other forms of materialism. He says that when you look at the commodity, not an atom of matter enters into it. We bear in mind the value of commodities as a purely social reality. So it's a social form. Things acquire and are traded within a certain form of society. I think if people can look at that, I think they will be available later on, those quotes, so you can look at them in Capital itself. We could just go on to the next slide, please, Tim. So having distinguished between those two forms of the commodity, the use value and the exchange value, he then goes on to make an important distinction as well within the commodity form. That distinction is between concrete labor, the use value form, and abstract labor, the value form. Now, it's very important, and people very often miss this, in my opinion, these are the most important categories that Marx uses, not just use value and exchange value. Concrete labor, he is involved in all societies. It's production for use, that particular form of labor. What Marx is interested in is the way that products exchange. And in order to get to that, he describes what is determined as abstract labor, the value form of labor. That's what underlines market forces, everything that goes on within the capitalist mode of production. And I have to stress that it's the capitalist mode of production that he's talking about. He defines abstract labor as socially necessary labor time. Now, that's quite a difficult concept to get hold of. First of all, it is not fixed. It's what is socially necessary in a given society. And societies vary over time and needs change over time. What is considered socially necessary is a social category, as well as labor. Labor time varies from society to society and according to the development of the productive forces, technology, etc. All those things can be constantly changing the abstract labor, the value form. But that is what Marx describes as his law of value, or his law. He's trying to be scientific about it, but it should be made clear that he's talking about particular society and a particular form of society. And the law of value is what he says determines value that's created within a capitalist society or a capitalist mode of production. And within that, that is the basis of his argument that you should avoid just looking at the categories of bourgeois economics, so things, money, value, etc., to look at the social relations that underlie it. That because abstract labor is a form that can be sold, commodified, it becomes the basis of exploitation. And as I think Ian explained in the previous thing, it's something labor can be commodified as labor power and sold. It is then purchased by the capitalist who can use it to create more value, because labor is the source of value than they've purchased it for. So it's that basis that, in Marx's opinion, or Marx's view, is the basis of exploitation, is the basis of surplus value, which is the basis of profit, rent, and interest. So far from looking at just the profit rate, Marx is trying to look at what determines that profit, and he finds that in surplus value and the creation of that in the productive process. So you could go on to the next slide. Now, it's important to bear that in mind when labor being commodified and the whole notion of the commodity form in those first few chapters. Marx runs in quite detailed form, and this is what puts people off about the price of corn, or the exchange, the way corn exchanges for linen and iron for other forms. So the commodity form, the basis of exchange, from that it develops into the money form. Now, I'm not saying that's a historical development, it's also a logical form, basically to ensure that the commodity form develops and becomes the dominant form. He describes that as the metamorphosis of commodities, how on the basis of exchange, a commodity emerges which is independent of all the other commodities and is capable of measuring the value within those commodities, the value being the socially necessary labor time. So he calls money the universal equivalent, that for which all other commodities can be exchanged. Money is also, because the underlying feature is the value, the labor form, he describes money as the necessary material form of appearance of abstract labor. Quite a complex quote, but something that without that form, without that material form, you wouldn't be able to develop the commodity production necessary for a capitalist mode of production. A material form is necessary, and that takes the form of money. He goes on from that, which is very similar to that, but people confuse that. So is money the price form? So is price just the value of labor power? He says that, well, I've said it, price is the monetary form of abstract labor. We know that when you go to the market, everything is displayed in terms of shops or whatever you buy or sell. It takes the form, it's given a specific price. Now, that price is not necessarily the value, but it is an attempt to represent the value of the commodity. So it can differ. It depends on supply and demand. It depends on all sorts of features within society. And it's the monetary form, but it's a monetary form that has to be developed by the capitalist. In order to start production, they have to assess the form of the market, what is capable of being realized, what is capable of being sold. Now, they might not achieve that, so it's always an estimate. It's something around which the price of commodities develops. Okay, could you go on to the next? Now, as I say, I couldn't possibly cover everything within capital, and what we're talking about here is surplus value that can take different forms. Marx distinguishes between absolute surplus value and relative surplus value, and he distinguishes between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit, and he does this in the various volumes of capital, which I say you can't describe, but it's important to take those into account. Before these volume 3 and volume 2 were translated and made available, people largely concentrated on volume 1 and said, you got everything you need within volume 1. To an extent, that is true. But it's also clear that as well as being produced within the productive process, surplus value is produced. It has to be realized. It has to be sold. It has to be capable of being sold in a monetary form, over and above the monetary form that was invested in it, in order to accumulate capital to start the process over again. Now, in that process, he describes that process largely in volume 2 of Capital, the different forms of capital and how the interlinking processes, the production of capital, the realization of capital, the reinvestment of capital, the accumulation of capital, largely in volume 2, which is very difficult to read because it's mostly in note form. Certainly not as well. Capital volume 1 isn't easy, but certainly not as intriguing as volume 1. Volume 3 is much better written, but he describes the different forms of capital. So we're not just talking about productive capital, which is covered in volume 1. He also talks about merchant capital, money capital, state capital, the different forms that capital takes, all with different laws, all responding to different rules, but all being based on that capital wage labor relationship, which enables those other forms of capital to develop and be involved in the production and realization of surplus value. Just finish. Well, I'll try and finish on this, on the way those particular forms of capital all interlink. So we have a total capitalist system, a totality of linking capitalists, not a simple thing. Now, all I want to do, and I'm sure I haven't done it at all successfully, is to say, well, the important thing about locating surplus value in the productive system is that notion of what is profit? Where does profit come from? As I said, the most familiar analysis of capital are what people term capitalism, and people can be opposed to what they see as capitalism, that it's unfair, that it's just commercialization, it's buying and selling, and we want to get to a fair system. Marx is saying that it's not socialism, or the alternative to capital is not just a fairer system, it's based on the mode of production. It's not a form of government, not a form of state, etc. It's based on the mode of production. And until you get rid of that mode of production, that exploitative system that's based on surplus value and the creation of surplus value, it's that underlies profit. And the underlying feature of that is the wage-labor capital relationship. And without an abolition of that relationship, you can't get rid of capital and the exploitative nature of the system in which we live. Just to conclude with that, you read capital, people read it as though it's going to tell you what's happening. Some people read it in that way anyway, to determine the way capital is going. And to some extent it does that. But as well as being a critique and an analysis of the system, it's also an analysis of the ideas around that system. You can't separate the two things. So as well as being an analysis of the productive system, it's an analysis of the consciousness that enables that system to persist. That persistence of the commodity form, the money form, the wage form, and the capital form. So it's a critique not only of the system, but of the consciousness that upholds it. I'm sorry to have rushed through this, but I've got very limited time, so I've tried my best. Okay.
You're muted, Tina.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm yabbering away. I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing it out. I was just going to say that we talked about it last week as well with the Communist Manifesto, which is of course also touching on this issue and the question of communists should engage with all sorts of social movements and revolutionary movements and always mention the ownership question. And no matter how advanced that movement is or not, and always mention, the necessity to talk about the means of production that are currently in private hand and should be in public hand, in common hand by the producers themselves, and that is in fact the root of all evil, and not money as such. It's just a symbol that's been used. Now over to Rob Gold, also from the Socialist Theory Study Group, to discuss the relevance of the capital on today.
Okay, Tina, could you stop sharing the screen and then I can...
You can just start yours and that stops this one.
It says it doesn't.
Oh, sorry, try again.
That's okay, we'll go from here. Here we go. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be looking at the relevance of capital to modern society. It's no small feat. As it's already been mentioned a lot, there's a huge amount in capital, and it's kind of hard to reduce it to something that's going to be covered in this time. There's a lot more that I could do to deliver this session with the clout it deserves. You've got to remember that Marx and Engels and other people around those two at the time conducted huge amounts of social research that kind of built the foundation of capital. I would say that we need a modern equivalent to that level of research and study into the social conditions that present us today to really talk about how relevant it is. I personally have been studying capital for at least 2 years and cannot with good conscience say that I have extracted all useful knowledge from it. But do not be daunted. The journey into the logic of capital, that is to say, the mode of production, the economics and the kind of money aspect, that you can embark on through the study of this book has proved invaluable to me for developing my own consciousness and has fundamentally changed the way I look at the economic landscape. This is not a book that lays out the definition of socialism or attempts to define the nature of a communistic society. It's a cold hard look at the foundations of the bourgeois economic system and how those foundations shape the phenomena that happen within it and in turn dictate social relations. So as already has been mentioned, the relations within this structure are fluid, and I say that they move and change constantly. So Marx's examples from the real world, although no longer true, are no longer true today as they were then. But at no point does Marx deny that this change will take place. So why is it relevant? Social relation that Marx expands in Capital still takes place. We still live under a wage system. The laws of circulation still apply to the production of commodities, and there's still a severe difference in use value and exchange value that can be seen in every industry world over. It's a good quote here from Value, Price and Profit. The will of the capitalist is to certainly take as much as possible. What we have to do is not talk about his will, but to inquire into his power, the limits of that power, and the character of those limits. Which I think sums up what he's trying to achieve in Das Kapital. He's looking at where the power comes from and and how that develops. So in the talk today, I'm going to look at commodity fetishism, which I think John alluded to, but didn't fully expand on. It's kind of a key theory from volume 1 that I'll explain a little bit about. And then we're going to look at surplus value in the modern economy and the financial sector in circulation. So commodity fetishism today then. So Marx's Capital distinguishes use value from exchange value. That is to say that they do not equate necessarily. He uses this to demonstrate how this obscures the exploitative social relation at the heart of commodity exchange. And commodity fetishism is that obscuring. It's the idea that the commodity has value within itself, and that hides the social relation that created the commodity. So we're going to look at a few examples in the modern economy of where this takes place. So as you can see from the picture, we have Prime, okay, which is a energy drink really marketed at children, to be blunt, and it's a drink that you can't see from the image, but is being sold there for £20 in this picture. So you know, its average price is £9 a bottle, but has the same nutritional value and content of a 50p price energy drink. All right. So why is this inflation different? You know, why is there this bottle that can sell for this value as opposed to a 50p bottle? Right. And this is due to the kind of influence on the social value of Prime generated from social media. Right. It's kind of a core concept of modern commodity fetishism, is that it's not necessarily about the product itself, but about how much buzz and hype you can create around the product before releasing it to market. Okay. Now this you know, this shows that, you know, there is still a large element of commodity fetishism within modern society, and that it is accelerated a great deal since Marx's time. You wouldn't see something this inflated in the late 19th century, but now, thanks to various advancements within the marketing and the way that capital works, this level of fetishism is now possible. So other examples include the fashion industry. In the fashion industry, clothing and accessories are often marketed as luxury or high-end products. You know, think about the kind of brands you can have around clothing, you know, Nike or Adidas or you know, Louis Vuitton. It matters not. You know, they are marketed as high-end luxury products, but the reality is they have, you know, usually less labor time imbued within them. So this adds on the kind of idea that surplus value maybe isn't only extracted from the productive process, but also from everybody else involved in the marketing of a product. You know, you could have you know, the whole marketing team, the advertising team, the PR team, all these kind of contributing layers to a final commodity, all working for wages, all having surplus value extracted, which then in turn leads to a final price that differs from the reality. Another example would be in the technology industry. So, you know, if we look at mobile phones, we know that they are increasingly becoming kind of outdated in a much quicker time. Companies will now create demand for products via, you know, advertising and, you know, gimmicks rather than actual use value. And you know, companies may release new versions of their products with only minor changes to previous versions, but they market them as cutting edge and essential, leading customers to believe that they need the latest product to keep up with latest trends. So again, this is this idea that you know, it shows that there is this social relation behind commodity. A commodity, the exchange value is inflated by that social relation. So moving on. Surplus value in the modern economy. So the theory of surplus value as being the basis of profit has a significant weight in the modern world. So if we look at the highest grossing company, if we look at Amazon, you know, we can associate that with you know, kind of equally poor labor standards. You know, so there's still a large degree of surplus value extraction going on within the current world economy. So surplus value theory really provides a framework for understanding how workers are exploited in capitalist societies. In the modern economy, workers continue to create surplus value through their labor, but the mechanisms of exploitation have really become more complex and diverse. So, for instance, I've included a picture of a Deliveroo driver as a kind of feature, a nod to the gig economy that we see. So that changes the way that surplus value is extracted. Not fundamentally, but its appearance is different. And I think that's kind of what the relevance is that the underlying theory of surplus value remains true, but the specific examples become changed. Another example for this would be the distribution of wealth in society. So surplus value, highlights the roles of profit in the distribution of wealth in capitalist societies. But in the modern economy, the concentration of wealth is getting into an increasingly small number of individuals and corporations, this has become increasingly pronounced. With surplus value, you can kind of analyze why that's the case and the mechanisms that drive that concentration. So another area that surplus value in the modern economy is kind of shown to be apparent would be in the financialization of society. So financial markets play an increasingly important role in the allocation of resources and generation of profits. Surplus value theory really provides a way to understand the relationship between financialization and the production of surplus value, and to analyze the way in which financial markets kind of distribute those forms. So, you can see that financialization becoming a bigger part of the current analysis of the economy can relate to the kind of idea of international surplus value extraction. So last area we're going to look at is the financial sector and circulation. Capital is constantly seeking to reduce turnover time, and this is mentioned extensively in volume 3. So, that explains a lot of the kind of modern developments we've had in the workplace. The fact that, online shopping is a wonder for this. It can instantly transfer your money into the hands of a capitalist and of one nature or another, and receive your product after the fact you paid for it. So we have a turnover time that is incredibly reduced in modern society, and there's extensive writings about how capital seeking to do that in volume 3. So the financial sector kind of comes into the fore in this area as it provides credit for both consumer and for entrepreneurs, for businesses. Getting all blooming spun up here, it's capital, it's stuff. Financial sector, really, this relates into the kind of tendency for crisis. Crises occur when projections of turnover fail to materialize, and this is to do with the credit system and circulation. All right. So the current crisis that we're looking at the moment, the Bank of England is forecasting recession in the next few years, and the kind of reasons, the external factors that are given for this is the war in Ukraine, it's lingering COVID expenditure, it's a million reasons that the circulation of capital was interrupted, right? And this is where the financial sector comes into it, because the financial sector plays the role of smoothing circulation. David Harvey does an excellent lecture on this, and he provides quite a helpful illustration. Shows like the financial sector is like a tank, inputting at both ends of the productive process, and then basically greases the wheels by which money moves around, right? So to prevent recession in 2008 and up to date, the bank has implemented quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is the process of distributing money to capitals. The bank buys bonds and assets from various corporations, therefore, giving corporations money by which they can then, it will trickle down into the economy, and then also using the assets to create jobs and whatever, right? So, this kind of, with that in mind, it's, really no surprise that we're currently under inflation. That's Marx describes inflation in volume 3 a little bit as well, talking about how it's the process when a nation overproduces currency and that devalues it, right? What am I saying now? So yeah, you can still see evidence of this if you watch. There's a recent interview with the governor of the Bank of England that really really highlights the fact that we're still, using this. They're still using Marxist terms. They're still talking about the labour market. They're still talking about supply and demand, which isn't necessarily Marx, but they're still in that kind of classical economist kind of thought process. So Marx argues again that the financial sector serves as a kind of mediator between production and the distribution of goods and services. It facilitates the flow of capital, and that remains true today. And that's why it's relevant, is because the analysis from volume 3 is very much, you can still look at the current financial world in those terms. The broad theory is mostly correct, and you can just look at the kind of explanation of crisis. It's important to note, and I don't think John mentioned it, but crisis isn't necessarily a loss for all capitalists. It's not a loss across the class. There are a number of capitals that will benefit from crisis and will piggyback on it and kind of ride the new wave of innovation that's come off the back of it. So it's this idea as well is that there's a degree of unity amongst the capitalist class, but it's not always unified. There are competing capitals that seek to benefit, from one thing while others lose out, and they're constantly kind of competing with each other as well, which is what creates a lot of the insecurity you see in the world economy. So yeah, I mean, the banks are still using interest rate as the kind of core tool they use to kind of control the economy. It's a lot of the kind of ways that Marx looks at it in Capital still remain true. So to conclude, I'd say that capital is definitely still relevant today. There's a lot in there that you can extract and kind of analyze the modern world with. There's also large sections of it that you can see Marx himself has got himself tied up in knots. It's not an easy book to read, and I'd recommend not reading it in isolation. All right, definitely with a group, definitely have discussion, see what different angles you come out with, and then kind of work from there. And that would be my advice, is definitely read it, but it is a commitment to read it. And I would suggest that if you want to get involved in that, then hook us up. We're all here, and we're all quite keen to study it. So thanks.
Oh, someone's mute.
So I'm sorry, I keep muting myself today. I'm sorry. It's sorry. That was a really good introduction into capital from different angles. If you have a question, I'd like to make a comment, please click raise hand. Can I please play devil's advocate and put something to the speakers that I've had put to me previously many times? So the question of, and it was in John's slide, profit is not based on the capitalists overcharging us at the exchange, which is of course what most people think it is. They've bought it cheaply and then they sell it on and make a fortune by it, or they inflate prices, they artificially restrict supply, create waiting lists that pushes up prices. Surely that makes profit for the capitalist. Why is that? Why is that not profit in the sense? Who would like to answer that, please?
No, I don't mind having a go. It's not that individual capitalists can make a profit that way. Ernest Mandel, for example, has an interesting discussion around what he calls technology rents. So let's take something like drugs. What you see in the pharmaceutical industry is often super profits over and above what one might normally expect to be a kind of normal rate of profit. And they're able to do that because they have a guaranteed monopoly on producing a new drug, which has often been very, very expensive to produce. And so for this period, they can effectively charge whatever the hell they like, and it bears no relation to the cost of production. But most capitalists don't, and there is a kind of a tendency towards an average rate of profit. The thing about capital is, what capital is talking about is society as a whole. So you're looking at the determination of the relationship between prices and values is a complex one, but one which is on the basis of an adequate part of necessary labour time, socially necessary labour time. So, if you like, so long as, in a sense, all prices and values are kind of equalised, then you can start to see how there is an increase in the social value of commodities as a whole. Yes, individual capitalists can be cheats. As I say, We Buy Any Car simply buys cars cheap and sells them dear. But the overall social production of social value is not like that. The origin of value is in that embodiment of socially necessary labour time in commodities. Finance capital, for example, is in a sense a parasitic form of capital. It doesn't actually create any new value at all. In a sense, it sucks value out of the system. It's one of the things that you can see at the heart of the splits in the contemporary Conservative Party, which has largely been hijacked by finance capitalists of one sort or another, and the way in which the tendency has been to deindustrialize because of an understandable fear of the proletariat, and effectively therefore export those jobs to other parts of the world where the proletariat can be more easily controlled. So the other thing about the things that you've pointed to, these kind of they are in a sense distortions, and it's a measure of the extent to which capitalism is in decline that we start to see these things. So we start to see monopolies developing, for example. And on the one hand, that's terrible because they can charge what the hell they like. But on the other hand, it's a measure of the extent to which there is a socialization of production. Huge monopoly. I mean, how much choice is there in what you buy in terms of a computer? Who makes computer chips? Monopolies are a generalized feature, and because of that, are internationalized and socialized, and without planning and without the things that can't be produced. So in a sense, we do start to see the basis of socialism growing within the womb of capitalism. So yes, I completely agree with you. The individual capitalists can be cheats, but that's not how the social value grows overall.
John.
Yeah, I agree with some of that, but I think it's always got to be put into the context of the international market. Capital is an international system of production in which what happens in one sector affects what happens in another sector. So you can see that being played out at the moment, really, with the energy crisis. The cost of energy is going up enormously. Now that has an impact not just on the consumers, but also on the industries that use that energy. So those costs can be a problem for capitalists. So somewhere they've got to get over that. It's also the case with the health service and the pharma industry, that the increasing costs of medical care have to have an impact on the social relations within the individual companies. We have an interlocking system that can constantly be affected by it. I also have to, this notion that there are different forms of capital that are adding to the costs of production. I think Marx's analysis is always to say that the value form comes from the creation, from the social labor, from that relationship between wage labor and capital in the productive process. The merchant capitals, the advertisers, everybody takes their share of that surplus value. That surplus value has to be produced in the productive sector and is then reflected on into the rest of the system. But I think it's important to bear in mind that, and Rob mentioned that, the interlocking nature of the system. So some people read capital and say, well, it's going to lead to a collapse of capital, that you can the whole system will collapse. but there is also features that can take advantage of those crises, that can develop capital in another form and expand their particular form. So I think the idea is just cheating can also have an effect on people. Cheating certainly goes on, but Marx is trying to show the dominant form, that items, commodities are sold at the value of production, and trying to, within that fair competition, how profit can still be made and how exploitation can still go.
Thank you, John. Okay, we've got Minnie, please.
Hi, thanks to all the speakers. That was really interesting and difficult job, especially John summarizing those three capitals. Just scratching the surface, obviously, but thank you. I wanted to say I did click through to some of the reading today. Just give me a second. I read, was it Freddie Perlman's piece on, let me just get it, commodity fetishism. Very long essay. Essays on Marx's theory of value. I found it fascinating, really interesting, and it was sort of dialectic and a bit like Marx wrote, in the way that he brought other political economists and economists in and just discussed them, play them off against each other. And Marx, there's some really inspirational quotes in there. I'm not sure where the quotes are from or whether they're from Capital, but just that Marx, such inspirational quotes about, and he talks about, I mean, it's a sad situation really, isn't it? Commodity fetishism and capital and what we're all stuck in. So I'll just read a section from Freddie Perlman's things. At this point, Marx vividly contrasts the idea of free, alienated labour with the alienated wage, labour, he calls it forced labour, of capitalist society, under the quote from Marx now, under the presupposition of private property, my individuality is externalized to the point where I hate this activity, only a forced activity, imposed upon me by external and accidental necessity, and not by an internal and determined necessity. My labour, therefore, is manifested as the objective, sensuous, perceptible, and indubitable expression of my self-loss and my powerlessness. I thought there's some great pieces of writing in there. I just wanted to read, I've been inspired, and this is only 1 minute and 10 seconds. This is about capitalism, and it's a series of haikus. It's what I call a haiku tower. It's a poem. So it's called Owned, and it's about what Rob was talking about, really, fulfillment centers, Amazon. Let's take Amazon for an example. Just this is what capitalism is like. Owned, and about capitalists and those workers. It's a shelf life now, as those 0-hour zealots up exploitation. Fulfillment centers, alienation for all, our imprisonment. Warehouses stack walls, and communal apartheid collects our ruin. Machines to command timed divisions of labour, a spied-on ratchet. Market battery, make weights for dipping toast in, the pickers picked. Scammed in survival, small producers can't compete, the turf war's being won. Impossible dreams, us patted down by adverts to ghost live our lives. Social relations, material with branding, their cash dispenser. Ours sold to struggle, commodified, yet buying the cost of living. Accumulation, commercial with its bullshit, to trouser glory. They reckon us up, but disregard the masses. Are we not many? Organised people, prime numbers for comeuppance, solidarity. I've got one more, it's only 1 minute. This is called, I'll just get it now. Oh, no, this is, just get it. 1 minute, 10 seconds. It's called On the Stump, or Fucked One, F1. So it's written with Formula One sort of on the stump. Capitalism, routine with roundabout lives, we are its wage slaves. In the dodgy jam of car crash economics, mobility jars. Embarked on work's wheels, and yet the dogged skid marks of competition. Burned by tire treads, our endeavours and efforts roadkill for profit. Our rights in reverse, we're lost to the win-win stakes of wheeler dealers. In a double dip, they propaganda pit stops to smear the workers. Media murder, doubtless death by snobbery, inroads to taras. Clamped down by finance, their interest is our compound and class structure kills. As their driving force, while they steer us to arrears, we lay the tarmac. How they've revved us up, always in pole position for revolution. With people's power, we'll have what's ours and shape a public climate. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Minnie. Bit of poetry. Ian is next. I think your camera is not working. Is that right?
Yes, it still seems to not be working on the computer. Yeah, I just put a couple of things in the chat that yeah, you invited me to come on, so I'll just feed them into the meeting fully as questions. I thought it was very interesting, Ian's introduction on how Marx solved the contradictions of classical economics with the insight on labour power being the one commodity that yields more value than it costs to produce. And that really seemed to me to get to the heart of how the economy emerges out of life, out of our animate life as opposed to inanimate objects in terms of the way other commodities are, and potentially at least centres the importance of the social reproduction of labour and the women's question, and how sometimes people say that Marxism doesn't have anything to say about that, but actually that these questions about the family and the reproduction of labour, as well as just the surplus value, the value involved in keeping the individual worker body and soul together day to day, would be part of that. And while it's the specific capitalist swindle of surplus value was what's obviously described in Capital, clue being in the name, it does seem to apply to the surplus and therefore class in general, of which capitalism's only the latest, hopefully the last. But in some ways, this swindle seems therefore the most normative version of the swindle of the surplus, because of the way you described it as not necessarily a con in that way, but an obfuscation. Whereas in a previous class society, you might be a prisoner of war who's forced to be a slave, or a serf living on the land with the lord riding into town. But in a way, although it's the last form, it also seems to go back to how it could be swindled in the first place. I just wondered what you thought about that. I know I'm trying to read out and then further explain what I put in the chat, and I understand it's a bit dense. Just thoughts, kind of had a light bulb moment in my head when you mentioned that one particular bit, so I wanted to feed in that about that. And then a much quicker couple of questions. I think Ian's already answered, because of what I was thinking about the surplus question. Does Capital say anything about the historical development of capitalism from past forms of class society? I think you said in the chat, in response to that, yes, it does. And controversially, perhaps, could it have been conveyed in the message of Capital volumes 1 to 3 in full, if shorter and more accessible? And I think Ian McPherson's answer to that, which makes it sound almost literary in points, in parts, and its examples very apposite, seems to put my mind at ease a bit about that, because I must admit sometimes I think reading the 3 volumes I want to read it. I had a bit of fun with comrade Rob about the first part of one of his last sentences in the chat. I suggest you don't read it except in groups, which might be a better idea than just the first part of that. But yeah, I want to read it, but sometimes I did worry that the 3 volumes, could it just become repetitive or extremely technical? And it sounds not to, but yeah, if you could say something about that, the emergence of the surplus from the conditions of our human life and the grounding of economics and first principles almost of humanity would be good. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Ian wants to reply.
Yeah, just a couple of little things. In volume 3 of Capital, at one point Marx talks about what kind of determines the nature of a society, what makes a mode of production what it is, if you like, is the way in which the surplus is extracted from the working population. So in feudalism, for example, the surplus can take all sorts of different forms, whether it's corvée, that is to say, you go and work 3 days on the Lord's land and you've got 3 days to work on your own land, and then you get a day off to go to church or whatever. Or in the ancient world with slavery and so on. So the extraction of a surplus product that takes different forms, and that gives us the nature of the society. No feudal serf, I should think, was ever under any illusions about who was in charge or who was benefiting. But well-paid workers, for example, can go to work and think, well, I'm not being exploited. I'm earning £2,000 a month or whatever. But on the other hand, actually, some of the best paid workers may be some of the most exploited. North Sea oil workers, in terms of what they extract out of the ground, they probably realise the value of their wages in seconds, whereas they continue to extract that surplus for considerably longer. So it's the way in which the surplus is pumped out of the working population which actually defines the very nature of the society. So that's one aspect of it. The other one you mentioned about historical aspects. One place that sometimes people say, well, if you want to start reading Capital, start about chapter 6, I think it is, where he talks about primitive accumulation. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, of course, how does capitalism get to the point where you have the surplus in the first place? I mean, if you look at, one of the things that was great for Marx was writing in Britain, which was sort of at the forefront of capitalist development. Of course, he could see what was going on in terms of Britain's history in general, England in particular. So, for example, the dissolution of the monasteries gave a huge impetus to the development of capitalist agriculture as opposed to feudal agriculture, and particularly related to the wool trade. Gave that a huge impetus. And so those sorts of examples of primitive accumulation, such as seizure of common lands and turning them into, and of course, this was a very recent, a very pertinent issue in Marx's day, the enclosures of common lands and turning them into capitalist agricultural production.
Thank you, Ian. Gary, please.
Thanks, and thanks to the speakers. Really interesting presentations. So just on that point, by the way, I think we also saw that kind of primitive accumulation in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, where you could say it was a huge theft by the oligarchs, which obviously it was, but it was also an essential step towards establishing capitalism in Russia. I think sort of my overall feelings coming into this session and listening to the talks was, I'm less inclined to say that capital has parts that are still relevant today, and more inclined to say that capital has got the keys to unlocking what we're living through today, and it is very fundamental and very profound. The basic idea that all value and all profit derives from labor is such a powerful idea, and is so meticulously and systematically sort of theorized and argued by Marx in Capital, and it takes you down a path that points directly towards the necessity of communism. The distinction between abstract labor and concrete labor that I think John was talking about in his introduction is a really interesting one, because when Marx is trying to root value in labor, there's a problem in doing that, which is that the labor involved in producing a roll of cloth is very different from the labor involved in producing a coat, right? So he says, well, there's concrete labor producing cloth, concrete labor producing a coat. One is tailoring, the other is weaving. In order to, we have to have a unit that can be common across all labor. So we have to postulate, right, an abstract notion of labor that is a kind of a basic, I guess, a basic kind of unskilled labor that everything else can be seen as multiples of. And that way you're able to turn the amount of labor in each commodity into a standard unit to be able to derive the value. And I think that's just a really good example of how difficult capital is to read, because it's very difficult stuff to work through, even in the first chapter, but also how powerful and meticulous it is in creating an understanding of the economy. But I've also been this is our fourth session, I think, and sort of stepping back and thinking, wow, the enormity of the challenge that we're taking on in this group of people, right? So we're talking about the need for some kind of Marxist organization, I guess a Marxist party. And we really are starting from what feels like ground zero, right? So, we've looked through the Communist Manifesto, felt galvanized by it, massively inspirational. This sort of incredibly lucid exposition and explanation of how history has proceeded through a series of class exploitations and almost by deductive argument, proving that the very nature and existence of the proletariat determines the necessity of communism in the future. It's not like we'd like to go there. It's a nice thing to have. It's like that is the only way that we can possibly go logically. Either that or society falls apart. We've also, looked today at how capitalism is constructed and profit is derived from labor. And similarly, that points a way through to the future and to what we have to fight for. And of course, as Marx has always said, the point is not to understand it, the point is to change it, right? So we're a fairly aging group. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say this because I don't know who else is on the call. I can only see the platform, but we're not the youngest, most youthful group of people. We've been around the block a few times. We're probably getting a bit tired. We've got a lot of wisdom, no doubt, and experience. But how, so for me, the challenge is how, on the one hand, do we bring young people into this and galvanize and enthuse them around these theoretical ideas, but at the same time, engage in the actual class struggle and be leaders of the actual class struggle. And that's the kind of the balancing act that Marxists have so often fallen short of, right? And we want to create a Marxist party, but we don't want to fall into the trap of virtually every, well, actually, I would say every Marxist party that we're aware of that's existed in the last 30 years, 40 years in the UK, for instance. At some point, I hope that we can begin as a group to start looking at how we begin to focus on that objective, because it's not a trivial thing. Thanks.
Indeed, and there are a number of traps you can step into, aren't there? There's dumbing down is one, there is being a sectarian, etc., undemocratic. Yes, we have to examine those as well. I mean, just to reiterate, we're doing the first 8 sessions now to basically give an overview of where we sort of agree on what we believe Marxism is. And then when we want to step into a second stage where we look deeper into some issues, but we also have to discuss in what you just mentioned, how do we organize, where would we go from here? And the way you just summed up capital, I think you should get closer involved in presenting perhaps a couple of sessions as well. Thank you, Gary. Steve, please.
I'm muting myself. First of all, thank you, comrades, for the talks and your insights. I just wanted to concentrate on one point, which in a kind of sort of been covered, but I just want to sort of add on to it, I guess. And this is this idea about fetishism, which is the idea of giving, as it were, social power to inanimate objects. So like money appears to be a thing, like it's a pile of notes, a pile of coins. In fact, I've got some in my I've got some in my purse. I keep looking in there to see if it's doing anything while I'm sitting there. It doesn't seem to have said anything or done anything, but it seems to be massively powerful, this money thing. Almost a god, you know, because it can like tell us what to do. It can tell us that we've run out of money, or we haven't got any money, or all those sorts of things. So this is something which is super powerful, but we've got no control over it. And it takes me back to what you might call orthodox economics, bourgeois economics, just to emphasize the point. Well, in orthodox economics, bourgeois economics, we have these things called factors of production. And we've got the three factors of production in this theory called land, labor, and capital. Now, capital is said to be means of production, like machines. And so they then conclude, well, if capital is means of production, then we've always had machines from the day when we first had hand tools. And even under communism, we'll need to have machines. Therefore, capital has always existed and it always will exist. That's what bourgeois economics says. It's sort of ahistorical. But of course, that's fundamentally flawed because, of course, capital is not machines. Capital is the ownership of machines. Therefore, it's a social relationship. Who owns the machines commands power over those people who don't own the machines. And in that sense, the society owning machines is not always been like that forever. It's only the latest phase in our development. And if you don't make that distinction between this thing called a machine and the social power of those who own the machines and therefore command the wage labor to do the tasks and et cetera, then you've got that. So it's this idea that capital is a social relationship between people and not inanimate objects like machines or money. And of course, Marx is showing that this thing called money, this powerful thing called money, of course, that is itself derived from social relations, from value production and all the rest of it. So he takes that back to the production of value. So that's my point.
Thank you very much, Steve. John, Ian, or Rob, if you want to come in at any stage, just raise hand and I can bring you in. John, there you go.
Well, there was somebody before me. Do you want me to say now? It's just, I mean, I agree entirely with what Steve Freeman was saying, that it is that your notion and that classical political economy turns social relations into things, that Marx is so clearly intending to reveal the underlying class relationships that are concealed within those things of money, capital, rent, interest, profit, those, to reveal them as social relations of production. But I was also interested in the earlier speaker, I can't remember the name now, but about that, you know, moving on from the class struggle of the Communist Manifesto produced in the 1840s to what we're faced with capital now. And of course, a lot of there's similar themes running through it, because a lot of the talk last week about the Communist Manifesto was about the spectres, hauntings, ghosts, etc., etc. Within capital, you've got similar sort of things, but largely based on mystification, vampires, fetishism, similar sort of things running through. And I agree, capital itself is quite a good work of literature. Well, it's not just about economics, it's about philosophy, it's about literature, it's about everything really. But just the way Marx was moving on from the Communist Manifesto, it always strikes me that what he's talking about, the class struggle in the early days of capital, it hadn't properly expanded to cover even the most of Europe. What he's examining in capital is the domination of capital. Capital has a dominant social form everywhere, and the way that has been reified in consciousness, that people cannot see an alternative to capital. They're so dominated by money, wages, things, those social relations of production, that they can't see a way out of it. So in terms of, you know, widening the audience, I think that's the fundamental role that capital can play, because it is an attempt to demystify, to break down that reification, and to create a communist consciousness that can envisage a different form of society that has the potential to emerge from this form of society. It's getting that message across. But what concerns me in a way is, a lot of people on the Marxist or the left tend not to read Capital. They read the class struggle, they read the Communist Manifesto, they read the class struggles in France, etc. And there's a consciousness that develops on the class struggle in itself and how to take power, etc. But with very little attention played to the mode of production, that crucial area that Marx is trying to analyze. To me, you can't really be a Marxist unless you read Marx and unless you have some understanding of Capital. And that's what I hope this organization that's developed would encourage that sort of development, to actually start reading some of those underlying features, including Capital in all its volumes.
Yep, thank you, John. Last person to have the hand up is Diana. If anybody else wants to come in, please click raise hand now. Hi, Diana.
Oh, hi. Is the microphone working okay? I've got
Yes.
a different one this time. Okay. Yeah, well, I was just the commodification had me thinking of it, reminding me of an issue which is really important, hardly ever gets mentioned, and it's related to what Ian was referring to a bit about use of agricultural land and commodification of food production, and that's getting that's accelerating more and more. Land being bought up by corporations, but worse than that is the pushing of genetically modified organisms, genetically engineered seeds and farm animals. Well, I put quite a bit in the chat about it, but what that does is that that means that the corporations own patents to seeds and animals, and also that stuff is actually not safe to eat. It damages the growing stuff. It damages the land. The exploitation of labor is corporations effectively pay for academic scientific research. So they're paying for, there needs to be research into agriculture, crop development for all sorts of reasons. But when you get the corporations paying for that, so the researchers or the exploited labor producing the genetically engineered organisms for these for the corporations to make money from. Not sure what else I needed to say about that. There's a lot I put in the chat about it anyway, so that's why I thought I'd draw attention to it. The thing was it's Marx was actually concerned about environmental, ecological issues, so that relates to that. But we've just had there's legislation going through Parliament now, making it legal to grow genetically engineered crops here. I think it may have been legal anyway, I'm not sure, but that's been heavily pushed. But worse than that, it's being made legal to sell this stuff for human consumption in supermarkets and other outlets, without the fact that the stuff is genetically engineered being labelled. At the moment it has to be labelled, but legislation is now going through saying that it doesn't have to be labelled. I've put links into stuff to info in the chat. So
thank you, comrade. Well, it's also companies are allowed to dump raw sewage into rivers for the next 30 years or something, which is not on foremost on their mind nature. But we are looking at Marxism and nature in the second part of this series, because, as you say, he did actually write quite a lot about it. Kevin. Hi.
Okay. Thanks, comrades, for three very brave attempts. Actually, much braver than I would attempt to cover, quite a complex set of topics. A question I have, and it's one that's been sort of on my mind for quite a while now, is, what's missing from Capital? And I think it was Ian who said that Marx had originally intended to really develop quite a full exposition of political economy, population, the state, foreign trade, so on and so on. And I've recently been reading, it's maybe 20 or 30 years old now, a book by Leibovitz on wage labor, and making the point that quite important ideas on the nature of wage labor are not covered in Capital. And that's not because Marx doesn't intend to deal with it, but he's, in a sense, working through it systematically. I think it's he sort of sketches out the plan in the late 1850s, but like all good academics and writers, he sketches out a plan that doesn't always follow through. And I just wondered if the three comrades there could comment on one, the problem of us, and I'm thinking of most Marxists, from the 1870s, 1880s onwards, regarding Marx as regarding Capital as the finished article. In other words, that's all you need to read. And the impact that this might have on our politics, but also where you might see grounds for further development of Marx's ideas. I mean, comrades have come in and have talked about different aspects of the contemporary economy. I think financialization, and particularly its relationship to commodity fetishism, is quite an interesting idea. I'm not trying to trip anybody up. Not only is it a genuine inquiry, but I think it points out that Marx himself, from what we know of his work, would have not regarded much of what he'd written as being, the last thing. And so I suppose I'm trying to think about how we might take this forward, and particularly looking at the developments in the contemporary capitalist economy, which in some senses are almost the, to the nth degree, are the form that Marx describes, but in other ways have gone off in very different directions. If we think of the capitalist economy in, parts of China or parts of the developing world, they have almost the features of 19th century Britain or Germany. But then if we think about the financialized and the service economies, the so-called post-industrial economies of Western Europe, they've, in a sense, have passed through that stage of almost, have gone beyond, not gone beyond, they've not transcended it, but they represent a different form. They've taken the form of capitalism, but capitalism has sort of exploited them, exhausted them, and has moved on. So I'm thinking about the gaps and how we might address that. I don't have any answers, but I wonder if comrades could maybe, think about how we might approach that. But, I'd like to thank the three comrades for, some very interesting talks and also quite a good discussion.
I thought you were volunteering to write an updated version of Capital, maybe, Kevin. Okay, we've got nobody else with their hand up, so I suggest that we are using this as a sum up. summing up, and I suggest to take comrades in the opposite order than they did earlier. So starting with Rob, then John, and then Ian.
Yeah. I was just really, I'll put my hand up at first to kind of come back to Kevin on like what is missing from Capital. And, you know, you're right, it is this kind of up-to-date analysis of the developments in Capital since the time of Marx. And yeah, I agree with the kind of idea that we're seeing a lot of the theories in Marx kind of expanded to the kind of nth degree in the kind of modern in the modern economy. But then there's a lot of ways that that's diversified and a lot of ways that that's changed. You know, I think I made a point about like kind of the impact of social media on circulation, and how, you know, how that kind of contributes to commodity fetishism. It's, you know, that's a whole idea that could be excluded, you know, expanded more. Our labour time does not really afford us much opportunity. Oh,
sorry.
That's all right. Yeah. No, I was just saying. Yeah. You know, our labour. You know, our labour really excludes us from being able to really do to the fullest degree. You know, we don't have an Engels sat on a factory floor in the same way that we once did. Although there are plenty of Marxist academics out there, but we need to. I think there needs to be that kind of level of social interrogation that Marx carried out to really progress forward. I'm not sure where it would come from, but I think, you know, that's something we need to discuss in future meetings, really. So to sum up, really, I still think Capital's relevant. I think where, you know, John and Ian have, you know, much sounder theoretical understanding than I do. But I think, you know, you can still see a lot of the kind of a lot of the trends mentioned in Capital still carrying out today. And if you know, if you listen to the governor of the Bank of England, if you listen to anyone in high finance, they're still referring to the economy in those classical terms. Still, the notions of supply and demand. There's still the idea, you know, it's still the same language, and the production process remains the same. So we have to, you know, kind of really. There's a lot to take from it, but I think there needs to be more done to update it to the 21st century.
Thanks, Rob. John, do you want to sum up now? You're muted, sorry.
Sorry, just on those points, Rob, I'm more theoretically grounded. I just think we're older, that's all. Probably had to read it a lot. Well, not had to, I still enjoy reading Marx. But just on those points that Kevin made, because I think they are very important, that notion that, you know, that basically it's not a completed work. I think what's interesting about Marx is he's constantly clarifying his ideas. That's what the notes to me reveal. If you read the Grundrisse, it's very rambling text, but sometimes it contradicts itself and it goes into all sorts of realms of fantasy almost, you know, but it's very interesting to read. But I think that's the important thing, isn't it? It's not a finished work. And as Ian outlined in the first talk, you know, Marx had, you know, very strong intentions of what he was going to cover, works on the world market, the state, etc. And one of the letters I read from Engels to Marx is saying, when are you going to start talking about what you really want? When are you going to start talking about that? So I think we should regard it in that fashion. It is not a finished work. It's a work that can be developed. I'm sure that's what Marx intended. I think also in this is relating to what Rob said about theory, etc. You know, just reading Capital, it always strikes me, and in these talks even, having to read, but reading the material again, you develop your ideas, don't you? You clarify your ideas. And even the contributions in the chat and the discussion that arises from that, it's a constant development and clarifying what you yourself think you know and what you don't know, and trying to do that. I hope that this group takes off in that respect, that we can get an enlarged discussion. Not that we're going to give everybody the answers, but we want to question what we know and try and develop those theories in order to relate them to the world that we live in, and also development of a consciousness amongst the people who we hope to be able to achieve a potential to change society.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ian, please, to sum up.
Thank you. Some excellent contributions there. I mean, Gary, for example, I think was absolutely spot on when he was talking about abstract labour, because of course abstract labour is the basis of human alienation. And if you think about the impact of that, on the one hand, we're all commensurable with everybody else. So we start to see that, therefore, that's the basis of universalism. So, and it's one of those features in which capitalism is creating, as Marx, in Marx's terms, its own gravedigger. But it's also other things. I mean, Frankenstein, that nice little Gothic novel. If you think about it, what is it? It's an allegory for a creation by humans that goes on to dominate humans. As a theme in literature, one sees it time and time again, particularly in sci-fi or whatever else. And if that sounds far-fetched, well, who wrote it? This is Shelley, who was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the partner of Godwin, the anarchist. So there was a kind of awareness of the time. And I think you're absolutely right about the need to update it. As I say, really, it presents us with the tools, a method. Look what Lenin did with it. You know, one of his great and not very widely read books is The Development of Capitalism in Russia. It formed the basis of his political praxis. And then think about the present. I mean, Marx, I don't think Marx could have even conceived at the extent to which fiat money becomes a feature of contemporary finance capital. The idea that, for example, if you go and borrow £10,000, what you're borrowing is something that some bloke deposited in another bank somewhere else. It's just nonsense. It's just numbers. And this idea of, and so what you end up with is, what Marx is talking about when he's talking about money is, you know, the universal equivalent. And he's for the time, of course, he's got in mind silver, gold. These are commodities which stand outside of usual kind of circulation and stand as a universal equivalent, an embodiment of human labor. But now fiat money, and yet if you're trying to think about what happened in 2008, what happened with the crash, and what's happened subsequently, absolutely, where are the contemporary political economists? Sadly, you know, Hitler and Stalin between them destroyed most of the intellect that was capable of understanding the times, and so we're building afresh. And I would like to see a mass communist party, and one which had that crucial interrelationship between theory and praxis. What was that thing? So Capital. I mean, volume 1 of Capital. The first couple of chapters are tricky, but Marx wrote it for ordinary workers to read. I read it when I was at school. Once you valiantly soldier through the first couple of chapters, it's actually very readable. Marx is a great writer, and it's not the sort of thing you can read in bed. But on the other hand, it's not as hard as you think. That was it. That was the other thing I was going to mention. Of course, Thomas Piketty is not a Marxist, but Thomas Piketty was making a clear allusion to capital when he wrote Capital in the 21st century. And if you read Piketty's turgid book, I've got most of the way through it before it defeated. I'll finish it eventually. If you look at Thomas Piketty's book, he is at least doing something. He's not a Marxist, but he's approaching it from an empiricist point of view, of looking at the way in which contemporary capitalism is effectively becoming dysfunctional by intensifying the levels of inequality. Joseph Stiglitz, hardly a swivel-eyed Trotskyist, a former economist of the World Bank, is writing about the way in which inequality has become dysfunctional to capitalism. But of course he's arguing as a Keynesian. He wants capitalism to survive, so he wants to see some sort of nice little reforms thing, the sort of thing that Jeremy Corbyn was very fond of. Jeremy Corbyn lots of nice pictures taken with Joseph Stiglitz. Stiglitz, not Marx. It was more of a guide to Jeremy Corbyn. It's got to be done. We need people to take the tools that Marx has given us with Capital and turn it to an analysis of contemporary political economy, of contemporary economics, and it isn't as difficult as it looks, and above all, it gives you I mean, for someone like George Soros to turn around and say, if you really want to understand capitalism, read Capital, it should alert us to something. The bourgeoisie are starting to recognise that actually there were some valuable insights into there, which might have avoided the crash of 2008 if any of them had bothered to read it. So yes, it's an unfinished work, and but you know, we're early days here. I'm going to semi-retire next year to concentrate on communism personally. But then, you know, I'm creaking on a bit now. I'll be 62 in April, so there we go. But I'm not dead yet, so.
Reaching zenith. Very good. We're looking forward to your retirement, comrades, so you can dedicate all your time to this series. Thank you very much, comrades. I thought it was brilliant introduction discussion around some of the aspects of capital. I think there's both Kevin and Ian made some good, very important points there. This is rather than the finished, answering every single question about, how capitalism isn't developing, etc. Marx has given us tools and a method that we can use to carry on demystifying what capitalism is doing in order, of course, to overthrow it. We're trying. We will revisit capital again in the second sections of this series in a future number of sessions. We'll also be looking at Marxism and nature, Marxism and the state, Marxism and democracy, etc., where we can go a bit further into more details. Comrades, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Next week, we'll be looking at the working class. Does it still exist, or has it changed entirely? Atomization, etc., etc. See you next week, comrades. Good night.